6,000 starving English soldiers faced 25,000 French knights in a muddy field. In 3 hours, one army will be completely annihilated, but it won't be the army you think. Here's how the most impossible military upset in history unfolded at Agincourt, and why the casualty numbers will shock you. French losses: over 6,000 dead, including their greatest nobles. English losses: fewer than 100 men, possibly as few as 25. To understand how this happened, you need to know about the man who led these doomed English soldiers into France. Henry V had been wild Prince Hal, drinking, fighting, causing chaos. Stories spread of him punching a judge in court, brawling with commoners in Eastcheap taverns, and once allegedly stealing from his own father's treasury to pay gambling debts. His own father worried the crown would pass to a drunkard who cared more about wenching than ruling. But the moment he became king in 1413, everything changed. The transformation was so complete it seemed supernatural. Suddenly he was focused, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. He dismissed his wild companions, paid back every debt, and began studying maps of France with obsessive intensity. He decided to revive ancient English claims to the French throne, a gamble that would either make him legendary or destroy England completely. The mathematics was terrifying. France had 17 million people compared to England's 4 million. The French treasury could afford armies England couldn't dream of. French heavy cavalry was the most feared military force in Europe, their knights trained from childhood in the art of war. But what happened next would make this gamble look like the worst decision in royal history. In 1415, Henry assembled 12,000 men and crossed to France. His target was Harfleur, a strategic port that would give him permanent foothold in enemy territory. This should have been a quick victory, launching a triumphant campaign. The siege should have lasted days, not weeks. Instead, disease swept through his ranks like wildfire. Dysentery, the medieval soldier's curse, struck with devastating force. Men who had survived years of training died writhing in agony within hours of falling sick. The stench of death filled the English camp as bodies piled faster than they could be buried. Dysentery cut down 5,000 soldiers before they ever saw battle. By the time Harfleur fell, Henry had lost nearly half his army, and winter was coming fast. The surviving soldiers were shadows of the men who had landed in France. Gaunt faces stared from sunken eye sockets. Many could barely hold their weapons. Those who weren't sick were exhausted from digging graves and tending the dying. Any sane commander would have sailed home. Henry's advisors begged him to retreat. His own nobles whispered he was leading them to slaughter. But Henry made a decision that seemed like pure madness. He would march his remaining 6,000 men 160 miles across hostile French territory to reach English-held Calais. It was either the most brilliant psychological warfare in history or the most suicidal. The march became a nightmare of starvation and constant harassment by French scouts. French cavalry appeared on ridges, watching, following, picking off stragglers who fell behind. Food ran out within days. The soldiers survived on nuts, berries, whatever they could forage. Many soldiers marched barefoot through October mud, their boots having rotted off their feet, leaving bloody tracks that French trackers followed like breadcrumbs. At night, they huddled together for warmth, too exhausted to post proper watches, knowing French raiders could strike at any moment. Some men simply lay down and died of exhaustion. Others deserted in the dark, preferring to take their chances alone rather than continue this death march. This was no longer an army of conquest. It was a band of desperate men just trying to survive long enough to see home again. Many had already given up hope, marching forward only because stopping meant certain death. But the French saw this as a gift from heaven, and what they planned would shock you. The greatest lords of France assembled the most magnificent army medieval Europe had ever seen. Word spread through every castle and manor house. The upstart English king was trapped in France with a handful of sick, starving men. This was the chance for glory that came once in a generation. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, commanded the host. Alongside him rode the Duke of Alençon, whose family had fought the English for generations. The Duke of Brabant brought his finest knights, each one worth a fortune in armor and weapons. The Count of Nevers arrived with a personal retinue of 200 men-at-arms, all mounted on destroyers that cost more than a peasant village's annual income. These weren't just soldiers, they were the cream of French nobility, men who traced bloodlines back to Charlemagne, raised from birth to be perfect warriors. Their armor was crafted by master smiths, polished to mirror brightness. Their weapons were works of art as much as instruments of war. Each knight represented years of training, generations of military tradition, and wealth beyond imagination. French confidence wasn't arrogance, it was mathematical certainty. They outnumbered the English 4-1, with fresh troops against exhausted survivors. Their knights represented centuries of military dominance, but more than numbers, they had psychology on their side. English morale was shattered. These weren't the proud soldiers who had landed at Harfleur. These were broken men who had watched half their comrades die of disease. The French nobles actually drew up legal contracts, dividing the expected ransoms from English prisoners. They calculated Henry's ransom alone would be worth more than some kingdom's annual revenue. Lesser nobles bid for the privilege of capturing famous English knights. The only argument was who would have the honor of personally capturing the English king and parading him through Paris in chains. Some French lords worried the English would surrender before they could win glory in battle. Others joked about whether to spare Henry's life or execute him publicly to teach England a lesson about invading France. Medieval warfare belonged to heavy cavalry, and the French had perfected it. A single armored knight charging on a destrier was physics in motion, 1,200 pounds of horse and rider, moving at 25 miles per hour, concentrated into a lance point. It was an unstoppable force that had ruled European battlefields for 3 centuries. Against disciplined cavalry, infantry had always been slaughter victims, peasants to be trampled underfoot by their betters. The French knew this mathematics intimately. They had crushed peasant rebellions, shattered Scottish schiltrons, broken Flemish militia. Heavy cavalry was more than military doctrine, it was the natural order, the way God had designed warfare. Knights ruled the battlefield because knights were born to rule. But the English had developed something completely different, and it was about to turn warfare upside down. The English army wasn't built around knights, it was built around the longbow. These weapons were marvels of medieval engineering, carved from yew wood that took decades to season properly. An English warbow required 150 pounds of draw weight, more than most men could even pull. But English and Welsh archers had practiced since childhood, developing the massive shoulder and back muscles needed to draw these weapons. They could send a cloth-yard arrow 300 yards with enough force to punch through mail armor. At closer range, they could penetrate even the finest plate. A master archer could loose 12 arrows per minute, each one potentially lethal. Do the mathematics, 1,000 archers shooting for just 5 minutes could send 60,000 arrows into enemy ranks. These weren't nobles fighting for glory. They were yeomen, farmers, craftsmen who had practiced archery since they could walk. In England, every village had archery practice after church. Every Sunday saw competitions where men competed to split arrows already embedded in targets. Archery wasn't just military training, it was national obsession, cultural identity, but it was more than skill. It was desperation. These men knew they were going to die unless they fought with superhuman intensity. They had nothing left to lose, which made them infinitely dangerous. The contrast was stark. French nobility on priceless destriers, armor gleaming like mirrors, lances perfectly balanced, versus English commoners with 6-foot yew bows, wearing whatever scraps of armor they could find. It looked like David versus Goliath, except David was outnumbered 4-1 and hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. The armies faced each other near Agincourt village on the morning of October 25, 1415. The battlefield was a narrow valley, barely 1,000 yards wide, flanked by thick woods that had grown for centuries. Recent rains had turned the freshly ploughed fields into a quagmire of clinging mud, the kind that sucked boots off feet and held them fast. For the French, this seemed perfect. The English were trapped with nowhere to run when the charge came. The woods prevented retreat to either side. Behind them lay hostile territory crawling with French patrols. The only way out was through 25,000 French soldiers, which meant there was no way out at all. The French deployed in 3 massive lines, each one larger than the entire English army. Their front ranks stretched across the valley floor, a wall of steel and horses that glittered in the pale morning light. Behind them, 2 more ranks waited, enough soldiers to crush any resistance 3 times over. Henry's men spent the night shivering in the mud, cold rain soaking through whatever clothing they had left. They listened to the sounds of the massive French camp across the valley, thousands of horses whinnying, armor clanking as men prepared for battle, the rumble of voices discussing the easy victory to come. Many English soldiers wrote their wills that night, scratching last words onto scraps of parchment with charcoal. Others prayed, confessing sins to priests who moved through the ranks giving last rites. Some men simply stared across the valley at their doom, too exhausted even for fear. But Henry was thinking 3 moves ahead, and his next decision would be pure genius. If you're enjoying this incredible story of how ordinary soldiers achieved the impossible, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's most amazing battles. The muddy field that seemed to trap his army also trapped the French. Henry had studied this ground carefully during the night march, noting how the woods created a natural bottleneck. The narrow valley would force French cavalry into a compressed front, preventing them from using their superior numbers effectively. Instead of facing 25,000 enemies, his archers would face only as many as could fit across the valley mouth at once. Henry ordered his men to cut sharpened stakes from the nearby woods, 6-foot spikes with iron points that would gut any horse foolish enough to charge them. These weren't just defensive obstacles, they were psychological weapons. A horse that had been impaled by stakes would scream in agony, terrifying other mounts and breaking cavalry formations. His archers took position behind these stakes, forming the killing ground of his desperate strategy. Each archer carried a quiver of 60 arrows, enough for 5 minutes of sustained shooting. Behind them, men-at-arms waited with poleaxes and warhammers, weapons specifically designed to penetrate plate armor through sheer blunt force. October 25th dawned grey and misty, visibility limited to a few hundred yards. Both armies stared at each other across the muddy field for hours, neither wanting to move first. The French were in no hurry, every hour brought more reinforcements streaming in from across the kingdom. Time was completely on their side. But Henry knew delay meant death. His men were consuming their last reserves of energy just standing in formation. If they waited much longer, they'd be too weak to fight at all. In a move that was either inspired or completely insane, he ordered his entire army to advance toward the French lines. 6,000 English soldiers, many barefoot and wearing rags, picked up their stakes and began marching toward an army 4 times their size. The sight should have been comical scarecrows advancing against the flower of French chivalry. But something in their step, some desperate determination, made French knights shift uneasily in their saddles. The archers replanted their spikes just 300 yards from French lines, well within longbow range, but close enough to smell the enemy horses. It was a direct challenge no knight could ignore, an insult that demanded immediate response. Henry had turned military disadvantage into psychological warfare. The French took the bait, and what happened next changed warfare forever. The Constable d'Albret, his honor impugned by English audacity, ordered the charge. The sound was like thunder rolling across the earth, thousands of hoofbeats shaking the ground, mail and plate armor clanking in rhythm, the war cries of men who had never known defeat. Hundreds of knights in full plate armor, lances lowered in perfect formation, came thundering across the field. Sunlight flashed off polished steel as the greatest cavalry charge in medieval history built momentum. It was magnificent, terrifying, the kind of sight that had broken armies and toppled kingdoms for 3 centuries. But within moments, magnificence became nightmare. The horses that looked so powerful on solid ground began sinking into the thick mud. Hooves that should have carried death to English lines instead churned uselessly in the mire. Knights trained for this moment found their destriers floundering, stumbling, refusing to advance through ground that grabbed their legs like quicksand. The perfect cavalry charge became a slow-motion disaster, a mass of struggling men and animals trapped in medieval quicksand. Knights who had dreamed of glory found themselves crawling through mud, their magnificent armor becoming anchors that dragged them down. Then the arrows began to fall, and the slaughter began in earnest. English longbowmen, shooting as fast as they could draw, sent thousands of arrows arcing into French ranks in perfectly timed volleys. The sound was like deadly hail, clothyard shafts whistling through air before punching through mail, plate, and flesh with sickening thuds. At 300 yards, longbow arrows punched through mail armor like it was cloth. At 200 yards, they could penetrate plate. At 100 yards, they went completely through armored men and struck the horses behind them. Horses screamed in agony as barbed arrows found their mark, throwing riders into the mud where they lay helpless, too heavy to rise. The narrow field became a killing ground where French numbers meant nothing. Only the front rank could engage, while those behind pressed forward, creating a compressed mass of men and horses that couldn't maneuver, couldn't retreat, could only die. Wave after wave of French cavalry charged into this nightmare, only to pile into the growing mass of bodies and struggling horses. The battlefield became a scene from hell, mud mixed with blood, screaming men and animals, the constant whistle thud of arrows finding their mark. French knights who somehow reached the English lines faced something they had never encountered. Disciplined men-at-arms fighting on foot, using warhammers and poleaxes specifically designed to crack open plate armor. These weren't peasants with pitchforks. These were professional soldiers who knew exactly how to kill an armored man. Knights trained to fight from horseback found themselves completely helpless once dismounted. Their heavy armor, designed for mounted combat, became a death trap on foot. They moved like turtles while English soldiers danced around them, targeting joints and weak points with surgical precision. But the most shocking moment was still coming. Henry himself fought in the thick of combat, his royal sword rising and falling as he battled alongside common soldiers. This violated every rule of medieval warfare kings commanded from safety, letting others die for their glory. But Henry V was fighting for his life alongside men who had followed him into hell. When a group of French knights broke through the English line, threatening to capture the royal standard, Henry threw himself into the melee. His crown was knocked from his head, dented by a French warhammer. A sword blow rang off his helmet, nearly knocking him unconscious. But he fought on, his presence rallying exhausted men to superhuman effort. The turning point came when the French third line, watching thousands of their countrymen die in the mud, made a decision that shocked everyone on the field. These noble knights, who had ridden to battle expecting easy glory, simply broke formation and fled. The sight of France's greatest warriors running for their lives shattered what remained of French morale. Those who had been arguing over dividing English ransoms suddenly turned their horses and spurred desperately toward the safety of their own lines. The magnificent army that had assembled to crush upstart England dissolved into panicked flight. The English army, that ragged band of survivors who should have been slaughtered like sheep, found themselves standing victorious in a field carpeted with French dead. The silence after hours of screaming and clashing metal was almost unbearable. The numbers were almost impossible to believe, so shocking that many refused to accept them. French casualties numbered over 6,000 dead, including virtually every major noble who had joined the expedition. The Constable of France lay dead in the mud. 3 dukes had perished. 5 counts would never see home again. Over 90 barons' men whose families had ruled since Charlemagne were corpses in a ploughed field. The Duke of Alençon, captured during the battle, was executed on Henry's personal orders when French reinforcements appeared on the horizon. The Duke of Brabant, arriving late to the battle, charged into the English lines alone and was cut down immediately. The economic impact was staggering. France lost not just soldiers, but the ransom value of its entire noble class. English losses: fewer than 100 men total, with some accounts claiming as few as 25 dead. Among the English dead were Edward of Norwich, Duke of York, and the young Earl of Suffolk. But these were individual tragedies in an ocean of French catastrophe. Make sure to share this incredible story with anyone who loves tales of impossible victories. This is exactly the kind of moment that proves history is stranger than fiction. The disparity was so extreme that many assumed the numbers were propaganda. How could professional soldiers with every advantage lose so completely to a band of starving survivors? But witness after witness, French and English alike, confirmed the impossible casualty counts. Agincourt marked the end of an entire way of warfare. For centuries, heavy cavalry had ruled European battlefields, dictating tactics, determining outcomes, defining military doctrine. In a single afternoon, that dominance died forever. Agincourt proved that well-trained infantry, especially archers, could not only defeat cavalry, but annihilate it completely. The psychological impact rippled across Europe. If English peasants could destroy French knights, what did that mean for the entire feudal system? How could nobles claim divine right to rule when commoners had proven superior on the battlefield? The age of the mounted knight, that romantic ideal of medieval warfare, died in the mud of a French field. The victory shattered French military confidence for decades. French armies would hesitate when facing English longbowmen, remembering the carnage of Agincourt. The mere sight of English archers deploying became enough to break French morale before battle even began. Henry V's triumph made him a legend, transforming him from ambitious king to one of the great military heroes of English history. Songs were sung, poems written, plays performed, celebrating the impossible victory. Yet, his moment of ultimate glory was tragically brief. Just 7 years later, he died of dysentery at only 35 years old. His infant son inherited the throne, and without Henry's genius to guide them, England's French gains gradually slipped away. Within 40 years, the English had lost almost all their continental possessions. The crown that Henry had won with such brilliance was frittered away by lesser men. But legends outlive kingdoms, and the legend of Agincourt lived on through centuries. It became proof that skill, courage, and determination could triumph over privilege and numbers. The longbowmen of Agincourt became folk heroes, symbols of English determination and common man heroism. Don't forget to drop a comment telling us which impossible military victory you'd like us to cover next, and hit that like button if this story amazed you. The battle proved that sometimes the greatest victories come not from superior resources, but from superior will. Those English soldiers, facing impossible odds in a foreign field, refused to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed inevitable. They fought not for glory or conquest, but for survival, and that desperation made them unconquerable. That muddy October morning in 1415 changed more than military tactics. It changed how the world viewed war itself. It proved that sometimes David really can defeat Goliath, especially when David has a longbow, tactical genius, and absolutely nothing left to lose. If you're fascinated by these incredible underdog victories, where everything seemed impossible until it happened, subscribe for more deep dives into the battles that changed history. Let us know in the comments which legendary battle you want us to explore next. We're just getting started telling these amazing stories.